How's it going, Elementalists? I'm back with another starter deck overview, and today we're going to be talking about Wings of Death. Wings of Death is a Dark Wind deck that seeks to win mainly through card advantage, and it gets that card advantage either through cards that give it card advantage directly, either by making the opponent discard cards or drawing cards yourself, or by answering threats as efficiently as possible with the exact right tool for the job. So as you can see, this deck is a little different from any deck we've discussed so far. There's only 3 categories here, and one of them has a bunch of subcategories. So let's go ahead and get into what makes it exactly so unique and break it all down. So first things first, let's talk about this big group here, the Unit Toolbox. The Unit Toolbox is basically the heart and soul of this deck and is what allows it to answer any threat efficiently. Because it has so many different types of units here, it always basically has the right tool for the job. So let's say your opponent has a lot of fire units and they have a bunch of health and no armor. Well, we have a bunch of instant death effects that can put an end to them real fast, like the Subtle Phantasm. The Subtle Phantasm's attack sides might look weak, but any hit point damage it deals is enough to kill the unit outright. So, if you have those threats with a bunch of health and no armor, as long as there's no pesky armor to stop these attacks from finding their mark, that unit is going to be instantly slain. Let's say your opponent is playing a lot of earth cards with really high armor and not a lot of health. Well, we've got armor piercing effects for that. The assassin's side and back attacks will completely ignore all that armor and get right to their squishy hit point totals and can often easily dispatch those threats. Let's say we're playing against ranged threats, or there's other units impacting the board that are way back in your enemy's lines that you need to get to. Well, we have a bunch of speedy units that can get there quickly and take those out. The Avian Acrobat is one of the fastest units at the game with 2 flying movement. It can move diagonally and cardinally, and it can move 2 tiles, so it can basically get across the entire board at once, and it has threatening enough attack sides to take out those squishy backline threats. Let's say your opponent has a lot of range attacks, or is swarming you with a bunch of units, or they just have nasty on-hit effects like these lethal attacks or freezing attacks. Well, we have a couple armored units that can hopefully weather that storm and make sure that you have board presence so you can continue with your game plan. And the Gargoyle and the Vampire, these are kind of the tankier units in the deck. And last but not least, we have a couple bombs. These are late game threats that are going to be very difficult for your opponent to deal with once you've secured your massive card advantage. So these are kind of your late game finishers, as the game will likely go late as you're trying to garner card advantage to win. And that kind of covers the whole unit toolbox, at least generally. You know kind of why the units are here and what they are expected to answer. So now that we've talked about how this deck answers all the threats efficiently to make sure it gets card advantage, let's talk about how it just directly builds card advantage. There are 3 main ways the deck does this. The first is probably the most straightforward. Cards like Swift Spoils will just draw you cards. The way this gives you card advantage is very obvious. You just draw more cards. Then you have more cards than your opponent. The second is by making your opponent discard cards. So cards like Cloud Scraper not only are very threatening in their own right with just super high attacks and good mobility and decent defensive stats, but also anytime this card deals damage to a player or it slays another unit, then your opponent has to discard a card. So this gives you card advantage by lowering the number of cards in your opponent's hand. And the last way it gets card advantage is through its use of recursive units. So grave abilities can be used anytime the card is in your graveyard. So anytime the card like a skeleton finds its way to your grave for 1 dark element, you can pull it out of the graveyard and put it back in your hand. From there, it can be converted to elements, or it can just be resummoned again and again and again. So this allows you to get more mileage out of your cards, which once again builds you card advantage. You can use your graveyard as a resource. So these are kind of the 3 main methods that this deck uses to get more cards than your opponent, and eventually the advantage just becomes overwhelming. And lastly, let's talk about the utility spells in the deck. A lot of these utility spells kind of fit in with the toolkit and are made for dealing with armored threats or just killing something outright. But the card I really want to highlight is Levitate. Levitate is an extremely flexible wind utility spell. For only 1 wind element, it is super easy to cast, and it can move 1 unit anywhere on the board, as long as it's not an enemy in your opponent's starting row, to any tile that is around it. So what this can do is it can move threats towards you so you can take them out safely. It can move things out of your way so you can just continue forward unabated, or it can even just push your units forward to put on extra pressure or give your units more reach than your opponent would expect them to have and take them by surprise. So this card is extremely useful and definitely one to highlight in the utility spells section. So next it's time to talk about some notable combos in the deck, and I'm going to start with Wisp plus Swift Spoils. Now Swift Spoils we touched on earlier. It's a spell that allows you to draw cards, but we didn't talk about how it gets cheaper to play the more movement score you have on units you control. So there's a lot of ways to make this card cheaper in this deck because there are a lot of very mobile units, but none is more notable than the Wisp. The Wisp costs 1 wind element and 1 Triversity, and it has 2 flying movement. So that means even if you don't have Triversity activated yet, it will pay for itself in the cost reduction to Swift Spoils to play the Wisp first. Because the Wisp costs 2, then it has 2 flying movement, which reduces the cost of Swift Spoils by 2 wind elements. And if you have Triversity active, you actually come out ahead. Again, the Wisp only costs 1 wind element at that point and still covers 2 wind elements in the cost of Swift Spoils. So basically ramps your Swift Spoils to play the Wisp. So if you have both these cards in your hand and you want to go for Swift Spoils, you might as well summon the Wisp. At worst, you get a free body. At best, you're actually ramping into Swift Spoils. And the Wisp is a body that, doesn't have a lot of attacks, but it has a lot of utility as it is very fast and has that pesky blink ability. So you might as well just throw them down. Next up, we have the combo that centers around Magpie Mercenary. Now, Magpie Mercenary, his main thing is his material motivation ability, which makes his attacks incredibly strong. The only downside is you have to discard a card from your hand in order to get that. And while there are a lot of ways to get extra cards in your hand with this deck, making this cost not that bad, there are actually some cards that benefit from being discarded. One of them is the Relentless Dead. The Relentless Dead costs 5 to summon him from your hand, but he can actually be summoned from the graveyard for only 2 dark elements. So if you use Material Motivation to discard Relentless Dead straight to your graveyard, you actually circumvent that initial investment of 5 elements and can start playing this guy from the graveyard for just 2 darkness, which can be very powerful. There's also the Blood Ritual spell, which normally can only be cast on your first summoning phase and costs a darkness element, but if it is discarded from your hand, you can activate its burst ability as if it had been cast. So this allows you to not only play the spell for free, but get around the restriction of only being able to cast it from your first summoning phase and cast it from the activation phase, because you activate Magpie Mercenary, you activate Material Motivation, and then you discard Blood Ritual, and immediately the effect takes place. So that can be very powerful as well. It makes the spell stronger, and it becomes free. And last but not least, there's Dragon plus V, the Master Assassin. Dragon we already kind of touched on as one of the main finishers in the deck. It has extremely powerful attacks and this nice AoE Fire Breath effect to take out swarms. But V, the Master Assassin, one of the heroes in the deck, can make damage from all of your units and spells that you control armor piercing. So now, you put this guy anywhere on the field with your dragon, and all of a sudden its attacks are massive and just get right through armor. And that includes its Fire Breath. So then it has a big cone of armor piercing damage, which can just be devastating to swarms. This is a pretty late game combo, but just these two alone can be very difficult to deal with. So it's a very strong combo if you manage to pull it off. When it comes to starting picks with this deck, generally I tend to play it safe. Because it's so reactive, you just want to play something safe in the early game and then react accordingly later on once you have a good understanding of what your opponent is doing. And a lot of the picks are going to reflect that rationale. So first off, we have the zombie. If you're going first and just going to have one element on your first turn, the zombie is the go-to play for this deck. Costs 1 element, it's recursive, so you don't mind too much if it gets taken out, and it can just be a threat all game. And it's just something that you can guaranteed play on your first turn to give you some presence. Now, if you're going second and you're going to have 2 elements on your first turn, you can actually trade this out for a skeleton. Basically the exact same rationale as the zombie. You can't play it recursively as cheaply as the zombie. It will cost the 1 extra element. But I generally find not having the slow reflexes ability that the zombie has is worth it. The skeleton can attack as it hits the board, and it's got that 3 front attack, so it's a little more threatening in front. I generally prefer the skeleton for recursive plays. So if you're going to start with 2 elements, you might want to pick this up instead. Now, if you know that you're going to be against unarmored units, it might be worth picking up a Wraith. Wraith can be really good into unarmored units and is a flying unit that does okay even outside its favored matchups. So you could do a lot worse than picking up a Wraith, and it is a very good option if you know or suspect that you're going to be going up against low armor or specifically no armor units. And like I mentioned with pretty much every deck, you can always opt to pick up some of the heroes in your deck. Ison the Favored is very flexible in that he just makes everything on your side of the field that's adjacent to him when you play him, and each time your turn begins, faster. So you can kind of just set up something nasty on your side of the field, then make it all faster and rush down the line and take your opponent by surprise. The Deathgeist can be very, very useful because not only does this unit have lethal attacks that can deal with threats on its own, but when it hits the board, something else is going to get lethal attack edges. So generally, you can 2-for-1 with this card pretty well. So that might be something to have in your back pocket. And last but not least, V the Master Assassin is a great card to build around this deck. We already talked about how it combos with Dragon, but it also combos with all the lethal effects very, very well, making them all armor piercing, so they're just automatic kills on anything, regardless of armor. This card does really well just hanging out in the back, and can even get into the fray on its own with armor-piercing attacks if need be. But I think it's most useful in the back, buffing up all your other units and staying safe. And it might be really nice to have this in your starting hand if you don't mind being a little riskier and not necessarily having that early game presence. This is a great choice if you don't mind not having the early game plays, just because all the other cards in the deck build around it so well. And now for some favorable positions. Again, this deck is so reactive that talking about this is almost a little silly on its own. Don't think of this as like a position. I'm more going to talk about strong areas for each of these cards and like why they work out well on whatever part of the board I place them on. You're not necessarily looking to be building positions with this deck because again it is so reactive, but any one or two of these things combined are at least ways that this deck can be proactive. So it's more think about them that way, less as like a full position that you're aiming for. So we talked about this earlier, but V the Master Assassin, just kind of safe in your back corner here. This is going to make basically all damage from your side of the field armor piercing. Very strong effect for this entire deck. You want to keep this guy as safe as possible, even though he has respectable attack sides himself. You really just don't want him getting hurt because the passive effect is so powerful. So having V in either of your back corners here, away from other units, so he's not going to get AoE'd or something like that, is very strong. Next up, we have the Subtle Phantasm. Subtle Phantasm does very well in this second row if you can afford it. While it's incredibly frail, from here, its 2 flying movement can basically threaten anywhere on the board. So, like, anywhere in the back row, you can get over here and threaten with the side attacks. And anywhere in this row or closer to you, you can actually threaten with back attacks or side attacks if you want to remain a little safer, perhaps. But again, so just having this thing center of the board in your second row, you can basically threaten the entire board with lethal attacks. And that can be incredibly stifling to your opponent. They might not want to play anything if they know it's just going to die. So just having this here is super duper threatening and can make them feel, very awkward about playing things. It's almost like they have to feed something to sacrifice it to get this thing to come out and kill it so that they can revenge kill it and finally deal with it. It's almost like removal that you play in advance. So again, ways this deck can actually be proactive instead of reactive. Next up, this is kind of a 2-card combo. Ison the Favored behind the Magpie Mercenary. It's going to buff up that flying movement to 2, and again, kind of give it sort of a Subtle Phantasm-like effect, where now with the 2 flying movement, it can just get anywhere, and that is super duper scary for your opponents. Obviously, Ison can work with whoever, making them faster, but is always going to be a little bit stronger with flying units just because they're enhanced mobility. And then these guys in front, these ones are just basically here to symbolize the types of cards you do want to push with when you are pushing. And they represent two categories. Either your recursive units, where you don't really mind if they die, it's kind of their point. You keep the pressure up with these guys, making sure your opponent is always on the back foot, and if they die, you lose basically nothing, you know? You can get this card back, it doesn't really matter. So you're not too worried about their lives, so you can put them in the front. And then also your hardier units, so your Gargoyle and your Vampire, you can push with these, especially with the Stone Form ability. It can be a really nice, like basically stake in the ground, confirming all of this summoning space for you, and you can just repeatedly use the Stone Form attack to make it incredibly hardy, and then you just have this summoning space and presence the rest of the game. So these guys are up here just to kind of signify these are the cards you want to be pushing with, unless you're like rushing in to end the game or something like that. So yeah, not exactly a position, a little not traditional the way I went over this versus some other decks, but I hope it gave you some ideas of like the strongest positions for some of these units to be in on the board. So I think that's going to do it for the Wings of Death. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you really enjoy feeling like you have the perfect answer to every problem, or you like using your graveyard as a resource, or you like having a bunch of cards while your opponent has few, this might be the deck for you. Go ahead and give it a try. I think you might really like it. And as always, I look forward to seeing you on the fields of Elementile.